I am Monique Coombs, and I'm actually not a biologist at all, but thank you for letting me be in the biology block to talk about ribbon worms. I'm just sort of doing the legwork for some of this. So I'm actually going to repeat a little bit of what Cole said. So yes, I'm the Seafood and Marine Resources Program Coordinator for the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association. We are an industry-driven nonprofit, yes, to restore the Gulf of Maine and sustain Maine's fishing communities. We work with fishermen from down east to southern Maine and parts in between, and our office is located in Brunswick. We work directly with fishermen members on issues around policy and advocacy, ensuring their input is a part of any process. As the Seafood and Marine Resources Coordinator, I'm able to work on projects that are driven by fishermen needs, their suggestions, curiosities. I work on things like seafood traceability, seafood education, marketing, and I get to plan a lot of fun events. Actually, just a couple of weeks at the Frontier in Brunswick, we have a very cool event planned. We're hosting National Geographic's Years of Living Dangerously, Collapse of the Oceans. It's a sold-out event, but we do have a few seats reserved for harvesters if anyone's interested. It is a free event, and we do have scallops, so it'll be awesome. So, for the past year or so, I've been working with the Marine Resource Committee in Harpswell, and that's where I learned about these crazy ribbon worms. I have a strong interest and passion, honestly verging on obsession, with Maine's fisheries and coast. So when I learned about these ribbon worms wreaking havoc, on the flats and voraciously consuming soft-shell clams, I wanted to learn more. There's unfortunately not a lot of experts in the world, let alone in Maine, about these worms. So I figured the best place for us to start would be to understand what's going on. Before I did that, I did ask harvesters, is this a problem? And do you need a solution? Do you need more research? And it was an overwhelming yes. I was able to go out on a conservation day with some harvesters last year. In just a short period of time, you can see we got 104 pounds of ribbon worms from a very small area. The next day, they actually went out again. I wasn't able to go, but I heard that they collected even more than that on the second day. So thanks to Maine Sea Grant and the Davis Conservation Foundation, as well as support from Brunswick Marine Resources and Harpswell Marine Resources, we got a little bit of funding to dig into ribbon worms for the next 8 months, no pun intended, sorry. So our goals are to work with clam harvesters and various stakeholders to identify the locations most impacted by the ribbon worms, those that are concerned about an increase in the worm population, so we're also seeking input from anyone actually, but clam harvesters specifically, about what we could possibly do with these worms. I've heard from a few clam harvesters that they were interested in things like striper bait, but we'll get into that in a bit. And I also want to add that at the end of the project, of course, we'll be sharing all of this information back with all of you, with the appropriate scientists, clam harvesters, communities, everybody that we've spoken to. Okay, next slide. So, actually I didn't do it. Okay, there's one more that needs to be on there, but unfortunately due to weather and timing, I haven't been able to get to as many resource committee meetings as I would have liked, especially before coming to the Fisherman's Forum to present on them. But I figured it'd be better to at least start this conversation and introduce myself so that when I'm calling or emailing about this project, you guys all know who I am. What was I calling? So this list actually, so the places in bold, Harpswell, Brunswick, Freeport, and Scarborough, are the places that I've heard from that have big ribbon worm problems that's most infested. MDI, Waldboro, Yarmouth, I've heard not as bad of a problem, but definitely have some interest in learning about ribbon worms. And then also Wiscasset needs to be, West Bath needs to be added to this list for bold. Okay. So if this list is incorrect in any way, or if you have more information, I would love to hear about it. You can either email me or stop by the Maine Fishermen's Association table. We're actually around the corner towards the front by registration. So some of the stuff I've learned and some of the concerns. And I guess I should say at this point too, one of the other things I'm looking at is research that's been done in the past. So sort of, collate all of it, avoid redundancy, and see if we can take some of what's already been done and move to the next steps. These worms are most often referred to as milky ribbon worms or nemertines. I have heard them called tapeworms or tapes in some communities. They are not tapeworms. Tapeworms live inside of people in their intestines after eating raw meat. But because it's part of local nomenclature, I don't want to just dismiss it. So they're a light brownish, pinkish, tannish worm that has a proboscis and a stylet. The proboscis is used to help the worm move through the mud, find prey, and consume the prey. The stylet is used to basically poison the clam so it can eat it. It's part of the proboscis, and it extends out of the worm, finds the siphon of the clam, and poisons it, in essence causing the clam to shrivel up. Softshell clams are the easiest for the worm to take advantage of because the valves are not able to close as tightly as something like a quahog. That being said, the softshell clams are the optimal prey, but the worm will also consume razor clams, quahogs, and other worms. The only worms known to eat milky ribbon worms are a couple of types of flounder, possibly horseshoe crabs and green crabs, and some birds. I have heard from a few harvesters that they've seen seagulls eat the worms, but sort of quickly fly off because they think they're gross. The worms are covered in this mucus that helps them move, but also makes them taste really noxious to other animals. And I'm really curious if anybody has seen green crabs consuming some of the milky ribbon worms. I'd love to hear about it. The mucus also, I should say, helps them survive if they're ever found out of the water, out of the mud for a long time. It keeps them alive. I started referring to them as the cockroaches of the flats, because it sounds like they are pretty hardy and can live through some pretty terrible conditions. Another thing I learned is that these worms just eat and eat. So when they're eating, they get bigger, and when they're not eating, they get smaller. They're sort of like a balloon that just gets big with air, and then when the air is released, it gets smaller. And I'll say much of the information I've gathered comes from a couple of scientists out of PEI. They started doing some of this research back in the 90s, and they have picked up some of it again. They're in the process of doing some experiments right now, and hopefully when they're done, they'll be sharing that work with me. I have the articles. After I spoke to them, they sent them to me. I think you might even be able to Google them, but if you're interested, just email me. I'm happy to share them with you, and I have them with me. If you want to do some light readings while you're at the forum, you can stop by and grab it. One article that I found, it was from something like the 1920s. It was on reproduction in nemertines. So there's about 1,000 to 2,000. I've seen some conflicting numbers about the different types of nemertine species. In this one fascinating article, Sexual Dimorphism in Nemertines, there was only about 2 sentences specific to the milky ribbon worms, and that is one, that they mate in April, and that when they're starting to mate, they turn a darker pink or red. So I do have some bad news and some good news, but we'll start with the bad news. So these scientists in PEI, when they did experiments with clams and other predators and prey, they found that the softshell clam mortality rate with nemertines presence was 100%. In fact, in one experiment, they placed a couple of worms in a tank with 18 clams, and it took those 2 worms 30 days to completely consume the clams. They also tried putting the clams and the worms in a tank with other species, and they found that the milky ribbon worms consistently chose the softshell clam over the other species. They also found that the worms would choose the clam flesh over the whole clam, which I'll get to in a second. In these experiments, they actually found that clam size does not significantly affect predation. And another experiment did add clamshells to the tank in order to identify whether or not this would throw the worms off course or anything. I'm using some seriously basic language to explain something that took these guys like 5 pages. And they found that no, the shells did not have a notable impact. There's some questions that I had that I just couldn't find the answers to. How long do they live? How far they will travel? Anything specific about how they reproduce? So I don't know if this is really good news or not, but here it is. So the worms, like I said, they do prefer clam flesh to having it to actually work at getting at a whole clam. What the experiment did was float some clam meat or clam flesh above some mud. They secured it with a fishing line and sat back and watched. And what they observed was a little worm would come out and poke out its little head, and the proboscis would find the meat. And the proboscis wrapped around the clam meat, and the worm tried to pull it back into the mud, and when it couldn't, it just ate the meat, which is gross. So I should also note here that milky worms are chemoreceptors, which means that they do look for the smell, I guess, of the clams. They seek out and are attracted to the smell of things. And I'll come back to that in a second, too. The other thing the scientists noted in a similar experiment is when one worm started to eat a clam, other worms would join it. So if there's a handful of worms around and a couple of clams, and a worm starts to eat a clam, the others will join it. I didn't find definitive information, but in one of the articles it was noted that perhaps the worms eat and hunt in packs. Hunt in packs is my expression. They had something much more sciencey, but again, I'm just summarizing. This next part is going to sound kind of obvious, but it's actually kind of important. The articles noted that in areas where there were fewer clams did not seem to have the same mortality rates of areas with an abundance of worms. So it seems that density greatly impacts mortality. The more worms you have, the more chance of mortality. The fewer worms you have, you might be okay. Okay, so what can we do and what else do we know? And this is some of the stuff that I'm trying to collect that we can then use to give to appropriate people to be able to conduct experiments, or perhaps even in some towns that have some interest on their conservation days or anything to do some of these. So can we track the worms? Can we use that information about the worms preferring the meat, the whole clam, to sort of trap them or attract them away from areas that we're worried that they're encroaching upon? Does removing the worms even help? If we were to plot out 3 to 5 areas and remove all of the worms from each area, how many days would it take for the worms to come back, or would they come back at all? So we could plot these areas and remove all or as many of the worms as we can, and then check the first plot after 1 day, check the second plot after 3 days, check the third plot after 5 days, and so on. And the only thing is I'm not sure how a control plot in this situation would work, because obviously if you just left one with all the worms, it would travel. What about a market for ribbon worms? Is striper bait an option? And if so, how do we make it work? Or do we even want to be putting these worms back in the water anywhere? The worms regenerate, and like a sea star, when they're threatened, they'll just drop half their body. So I don't think they would stay on the hook too well, but maybe you could freeze dry them or put them in a food processor. I didn't find any specific information about this, but I don't think they're edible. Perhaps they could be used for something like biomedical research and development. I am kind of curious. I don't recommend it, but if anybody's tried to eat one, it'd be kind of cool to hear about. But again, I didn't say to try it. Okay, so what's next? And I have to be honest, I don't mean to be over dramatic here. When I spoke with some of the scientists who conducted the research in PEI, I mentioned to them that we had green crab problems in the state of Maine, and we both wondered if whether or not the green crabs helped attract the influx of ribbon worms, because as the green crabs broke up the soft-shell clams, of course it exposed the flesh and then perhaps attracted. But again, we were just wondering, it's not proven by any means. Where did they come from? Are they here to stay? We know that they're not invasive. They've been here all along, seeing 1 or 2 worms here and there, but As we can see from previous pictures or even pictures that were going through the slideshow, there are quite a few ribbon worms around. If you're interested, I have a couple of videos. They're pretty gross. And if we do a good job getting rid of all of them, is something going to take its place? So, you know, it's easy to point to that one thing and say, if we fix this and we fix everything, oh, get rid of the ribbon worms, we're good. But I think this issue and others like ocean acidification, warming waters, green crabs, other predators, need to be examined as part of a larger ecosystem. So, in closing, I have some postcards with me that just have some basic questions about Milky ribbon worms. When you're in the mud, that would be great if you were thinking about things like, what color are they? Are there green crabs around? Is there a history of green crabs being around? Are there other species? Do you see the birds eating them? It seems like really simple information, but if we can find differences or similarities in towns, it might help lead us to other experiments or things that we could be thinking about. And again, like I said, I really just wanted to introduce myself, so when I start calling to come to your Marine Resource Committee meetings or chat with you some more, that I'm not just some stranger. I'm also happy to go in the mud and dig worms. I've only gotten stuck once, so can't promise it won't happen again. So again, thank you very much. The Maine Coast Fishermen's Association table is just around the corner. I'd love to chat some more, so thank you. Oh.